Hello, everyone. This is Margaret Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Loess Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge, Crossroads and Habitat for Trumpeter Swan Conservation. And we have quite a few people that have registered for this, and quite a few of you are from Missouri. And associated with maybe the Facebook group of Loess Bluffs and our regular e-news people. So welcome to everyone for coming. We're just thrilled to bits to have you here. Today's webinar is being recorded. You are muted and your video is turned off, but we welcome questions, but we take the questions at the end. So if you have questions as you're going along, just put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And that way we'll get to those at the end. And at the very end of the webinar, as you're closing out your browser, there'll be a very short survey of 5 questions. That's really important for me, for you to fill that out if you can. And 2 days after the recording, you will receive a link to the webinar for you to watch again or share with others. And before we get started, I want to introduce 2 people from the Trumpeter Swan Society. Marianne Coughlin is with us, and she will be the one asking the questions that you put into the Q&A box. And then also Jeff Nelson, who's our president of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And Jeff, do you want to just tell folks a little bit about what the Trumpeter Swan Society does?
Sure. Thanks, Margaret, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. The Trumpeter Swan Society has been around since the 1960s and really got its start trying to restore trumpeters back to their historic range across North America. We did a lot of work early on, just putting birds, actually physically getting them out on the ground and getting them started. And that's really evolved now to where we're really into our education program through things like these webinars, through our newsletter. We try to engage our members and people on the ground who are interested in trumpeters through Trumpeter Watch, which you'll hear about, many observations coming out of Loess Bluffs. And of course, we fund different projects, whether it's research, like we did with another project that was through the University of Minnesota. We're tracking trumpeter swans to see just where they're going now as they continue to expand into their historic range. We do get involved to some degree with writing letters if we need to Congress with our partners. And we do a lot of work with the joint ventures and others in trying to get trumpeter swan habitat back on the ground. So today I'm really interested personally. I've known about Loess Bluffs for a long time, visited once there, but this is one of the areas that the trumpeters have picked up on as a big wintering area for populations as they expand, especially in the interior population. So with that, I'll just say thank you again for joining us, and thanks for your support of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And I'll turn it over to Darren, who's going to give our talk today.
Good morning, and thanks for joining the talk today to hear about trumpeter swans on Loess Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge. So I'd like to send a special thanks to Dan Staples, who provided a number of pretty much all the trumpeter swan photos today, plus a few eagle ones. And he basically he comes out to the refuge almost every day during the week and taking pictures. And all these pictures that you see in this slide presentation were basically taken right off of our auto tour loop on the refuge. So basically, this presentation is going to be Loess Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge, a crossroad and habitat for trumpeter swan conservation. So usually when I've been asked to speak, sometimes people, they want to, obviously you guys can see what I look like on the thing, but a lot of times they'll want a picture ahead of time. So I don't really like pictures of myself. So I usually send something like this. This is a baby alligator, something like this, or an alligator with a turtle in its mouth. This is Puddles, our blue goose. So I'd send something like that. And then finally I might send something like this. And this is me from about 10-15 years ago, and this is my son who's now 20 years old. So this probably wouldn't feel very good if he was standing on my shoulders, but I did my undergrad at University of Nebraska at Lincoln, graduated in '99. And then I graduated with a master's in fisheries and wildlife resources in 2001 from West Virginia University. I've been with the National Wildlife Refuge System since the late 90s, since about 98. I worked at Sietskity National Wildlife Refuge, which is in southwestern Wyoming. And then I did that for a couple of years, and then I did some prescribed firework in 99 to 2000, and then I went to the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, coastal Texas, for about 10 years, and I worked as a prescribed fire technician for the first couple of years, and then I was a biologist for about 6 years down there. And then I've been here at Loess Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge for about 16 years as a wildlife biologist. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is part of the Department of the Interior. There's basically 9 different bureaus or 3 to 4 letter agencies that make up the Department of Interior. And the mission of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to work with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. So if you drill a little further down in that, I worked for the National Wildlife Refuge System, which started in 1903 with the first refuge being Pelican Island. And now we have like over 150 million acres and over 573 national wildlife refuges. And its mission is very similar to the Fish and Wildlife Services. It's to manage a national network of lands and waters for conservation management, where appropriate, to restore fish and wildlife and plants and their habitats. So to drill a little further down, every refuge has a purpose, and most of the refuges that I've worked for kind of use this blanket purpose, which is as a refuge and breeding ground for migratory birds and other wildlife. And this refuge was originally named Squaw Creek National Wildlife Refuge, and the name was changed to Loess Bluffs in 2017. So basically, for people who are outside of Missouri or the Midwest, this is a map of the United States, and it's basically showing where Loess Bluffs is located at. We're located in northwest Missouri, pretty much right here where the mark is on the map, but basically almost smack dab in the middle of the country. There's basically 9 different refuges in Missouri, and we're located up here in the northwest corner. Here's a little bit more of a closer zoomed in portion. We sit about an hour and a half or so south of Omaha, Nebraska, and about the same distance from Kansas City. And it would be roughly about the same distance if you can go as a crow flies from Des Moines, but we're probably closer to 3 hours or so. So Loess Bluffs National Wildlife Refuge, here's another like zoomed in view that kind of shows you that we're up here by Iowa. We're in the northwest part of Missouri. We're in Holt County, and we're really close to Nebraska. And basically we sit in the Missouri River floodplain. And the reason why the refuge is named Loess Bluffs is we have a portion, like around 700 to 800 acres of the refuge sits in has the Loess Hills, which are basically it's a type of soil. Loess is a type of soil. It's kind of like a silty, loamy soil that's kind of wind blown, and that's how these hills were created back during the Ice Age. And there's less soil in a number of states, but there's only probably 4 or 5 places in the world where that actually forms like hills, and we're one of those places. And Loess is a German word. Some people say Loess, but most of us around here call it Loess. So habitat on the refuge, the refuge itself is only 7,400 acres in size, which for Missouri is a decent size wildlife area, but it's not large by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, if you look at certain national forests or other refuges that are may be 100 acres or a couple hundred acres in size. But we pack a lot of stuff in a small area. It has like roughly around 3,700 acres of wetlands. We have about 1,400 acres in woodland or forest type habitat, and about 2,100 acres in prairie. And then what I have listed is like 240 to 250 of developed land, which would be our roads, our levees, infrastructure, and that type of stuff. So the refuge itself is open like 365 days out of the year, unless we're closed because of like some sort of natural disaster, like a flood, or maybe if we might close it down short-term basis, or close a portion of it down if we're doing prescribed fire operations, or if there is a lot of snow that we need to clear the roads. But in those instances, usually the highways are kind of difficult to get up here. And the refuge is basically open like a half hour before sunrise to a half hour after sunset. And our visitor center, or visitor contact station, is basically open during fall and spring migration, Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And we have like a little museum area, some mounts and that type of stuff up here. But basically we have a 10-mile tour loop that goes around the refuge. Most of it's one way, this section right here. There's two-way traffic like right here. And basically we sit like about 2 miles off of I-29 on one side, and like maybe like 2.5 or 3 off of I-29 up by Mountain City. So wildlife, even though Loessbluffs isn't a really large area, there's been over 310 species of birds that have been documented. High or peak number of trumpeter swans. We've had like over almost 4,200 trumpeter swans that have wintered on the refuge, and we get really large numbers of bald eagles. We've had like over 1,000 this year, which was a record, where our previous record was like 833 from like 2 years ago. Then we get like around 200,000 to 300,000 snow geese in the fall, and about over 1 million of snow geese in the spring. 200,000 species of ducks, and as many as 60,000 shorebirds of various species, up to 20 plus species of shorebirds. We have 41 species of mammals and 37 species of reptiles and amphibians. So part of the reason why Loessbluffs is kind of a crossroads, or an important area, is, for one, it's been around since 1935 in a floodplains that we sit like 4 or 5 miles off of the Missouri River, in the Missouri River floodplain. And we also sit like we're technically in the Mississippi flyway, but this map kind of shows us in the central the way it is. But most of the time you look at flyway maps and they group out the whole state. This is probably closer to how it probably actually is. We sit on the edge of the central flyway, and we're in the Mississippi flyway. So that's why Loessbluffs is a really good funnel area for waterfowl and other birds. So this picture actually was drawn by one of my younger kids, and a common joke that we have around here when people ask us, hey, have you seen any eagles? Because that's one of the things that some of the people want to see. This is one of Dan's pictures, as you can obviously tell, and we get a really large number of eagles that tend to spend December and part of January here on the refuge. Those are probably the best times to see large numbers of eagles here. And these are like 3 trees, and there's probably like 40 eagles in it. So they'll get up in a lot of the trees that we have around the wetlands. Then we'll get some ice. They'll hang out on the ice, and we have a fairly decent number of muskrat huts that they'll sit on, looking for waterfowl to feed on. So this kind of gives you an idea of some of the peak numbers that we've had on the refuge. Like in 2001, the peak number was 476, but that number wasn't broken until 2020, where we had 661, and then we broke the 833 record in 2025 on December the 30th. So this kind of just highlights one of the bird survey protocol that we use when I'm going around and surveying for birds. So basically I do like a weekly waterfowl survey, which I also incorporate eagles, starting in roughly September, and I run it until just about May and into June. It's the integrated water bird management monitoring program. It monitors water birds, so basically waterfowl, shorebirds, and wading birds. And from that, we can kind of get bird use days per area. We can generate migration curves. We also have a vegetation component, so we can kind of see if some of the management techniques we're using, if it correlates with some of the bird numbers that we're seeing. And then, but it was kind of set up as a flyaway model across a number of different areas. It was started in Mississippi and the Atlantic flyway. So if anybody wants to know what close to 1 million snow geese looks like, this is basically kind of what it looks like. I kind of drew the outline in red so you can kind of see it. And basically, this is some older photos that I took off of our bluff pool trail that our Loess Bluffs trail, which is behind our office here, that basically walks up a couple 100 feet above elevation wise. And I stitched together some images to kind of give you an idea. This is from like an older photos that I have from probably one of the earlier iPhones. But primarily we're using site surveys to count birds using kind of like a block method. But these next two images basically show you where we've had aerial photos taken, and then they've actually used machine learning and GIS to count up the birds. And this is the number that they came up with. And it was taken on a day similar to where I did the survey. So this basically kind of shows you like how dense they are. So, I mean, if you look at the closer to 14,000 birds per acre, that's this darker stuff, and this lighter stuff is closer to like 966 birds per acre. And that's how they came up with that 1.3 million birds. And just kind of looking at trumpeter swans, I came here in 2010, so a high number for us was like 148. The first year I was here, it was 120, and then we basically broke 4,000 in 2024. So the trumpeter swan numbers have really exploded since I got here. And basically, if you look at like a percent increase, it's like almost 3,400% increase, which is a pretty high number. And you can obviously see this trend line as it kind of skates across the map. But so like this kind of illustrates bird numbers increasing and blowing up. So, and this is like a migration curve from that 4,199 bird year that kind of illustrates, and I could plot similar graphs and it'll kind of show you like if somebody is like trying to target when is the best time to come and see large numbers of trumpeter swans on the refuge. Obviously, it's going to vary year to year, depending upon when we ice up, how much snow we have, because sometimes that stuff may push birds further south. But on a normal year, birds will start showing up the latter part of October, and they'll stay until pretty much the end of April. And we've had trumpeter swans in really low numbers into June or July. We haven't had any successfulness on the refuge. We've had at least what we thought were one nest attempt. I didn't go up and see if there was actually eggs, but it looked like we had birds sitting on a nest for almost a month or two. And then we've had the occasional juvenile bird that's kind of hung in there. But we do get 3 different species of swans. Obviously the trumpeter swan, and then we'll get tundra swans that have various amounts of yellow on the lowers, and that's one of the easiest ways. The other way is to kind of look at the eye separated from the bill. And then we'll get the occasional mute swans, but with the tundras and the mutes, it's like trying to play Where's Waldo. You're looking through numerous amounts of trumpeter swans to find a very small number of tundras. But here you can see yellow on the lures on both, and a little bit of eye separation, kind of the same thing. The same thing. This is like a little bit not a zoomed in picture as what you were looking at earlier. And these don't necessarily, I mean, I'm just showing a number of tundras just to kind of give you an example, but we get a heck of a lot more trumpeter swans. And here's a mute swan that we'll get from time to time. I would probably say at least once a year, maybe every other year. Not that we want a bunch of mute swans out there because they're non-native, but we do get them. Trumpeter swan threats on the refuge. Sometimes we have some predation due to predators. Eagles, I would assume, only usually get them when the birds are sick or if they're dead, because oftentimes you'll see them right next to each other, and the trumpeter swans usually don't pay them too much of a mind. But occasionally we will have a predator encounter with like this coyote that you see on the left hand side. I should have probably said viewer discretion advised. But and then the other thing, which is common, which are power lines, and we have them all around the refuge. But thanks to the work of Jim Pearson, who was a retired Fish and Wildlife Service special agent, and our local Missouri Department of Conservation agents, they worked with the power company and got, because we were having some collision, got the power company to put some of these markers on the vast majority of the power lines that we have around the refuge. But as you can see, I have like this little image here of power lines. Well, if you have a lot of times when swans are moving back and forth, because sometimes they'll feed on waste grain off the refuge, mostly corn. And when they're moving pool to pool or from area to area, a lot of times they're just flying at the treetop, or they're flying at about power line height. And then if you get some fog, obviously this kind of simulates fog. You can't really see the power. They can't really see the power lines, and that's how they fly into them. That, and if it's a low light level condition at the time, like early in the morning or as the sun's going down. Then we've also had some wildlife disease that's been documented on the refuge. We've had some avian cholera. We've had avian cholera on the refuge probably every couple of years since I've been here. And then we've more recently, since like 2022, we've had avian influenza pop up from time to time. And typically what we do is we'll collect a specimen and send it into the National Wildlife Health Center. Then they'll do their test and confirm, and then to positively confirm it, they'll send it to the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Veterinary Service Laboratory. And then I'm also in communication with the state, Missouri Department of Conservation, or MDC's vet, and then the Missouri Department of Ag's vet as well, just so they're aware of what's going on. So then that kind of leads us to what are some different ways to track swans. And the old school way of doing it, basically, for waterfowl, birds that are hunted, they'd put what was the Fish and Wildlife Service metal band, but now is a USGS metal band. But for birds that don't get hunted, or ones where they're wanting to see movement and survivorship data, they'll put auxiliary markers, much like this neck collar here, that we found from a well, we didn't actually find the swan, we just found the neck collar. We assume that he probably died though. And then and obviously you can see them from people see them using optics, or they take pictures like Dan's pictures here, and then they report them to like the Trumpeter Swan Watch. And Margaret's and the folks at the Trumpeter Swan Watch do a pretty good job of letting the banders know like where their birds, because they ask like where the bird had been seen, coordinates, the day, and kind of like how many number of swans, and other data associated with it. And you can also report the band to USGS if you Google like report a band, and these are basically the links to both of them. If you Google Trumpeter Watch, it'll come right up there, and people that are familiar with filling it out, it's a pretty easy process. So basically, if you are able to come into our office, you'll see an image of this swan that basically has some of the rust color stuff on the head. This is 59NC, and it was banded in 1989 in Hennepin County, Minnesota. And then in February of 1990, it was spotted in Sunset Lake, Oklahoma. So if you kind of look here, you can see in Oklahoma where it's been located. And then in December of 1994, his mate and 3 cygnets stopped at Loess Bluffs in the winter of 97 and 98, and then later it migrated with a brood of 7 cygnets for several years each spring in Wright County near Buffalo, Minnesota. And then in May of 1999, it flew into a power line. And it basically, its collar and a mount of it, along with this image and kind of a little bit about the story of this particular swan, rests in the refuge. And this this display was basically funded by donations by the Trumpeter Swansociety in the memory of Donna Compton, Hennepin Park wildlife technician and Trumpeter Swansociety administrative assistant. So it's a great display because it has a tundra swan in it right next to the Trumpeter Swan, so you can kind of see the size. It's got you can definitely tell the change in the eye, and it has a little bit of yellow on the lores, at least the way they have it set up. So, oops. Well, hiccup. All right. But I mean, here's 9MO. I'm going to kind of flip through a couple of slides relatively quickly so you guys can kind of see. 9MO was basically banded in 2012. He's from Iowa. He's from Mount Air, Iowa. And it was banded in 2012. So, and we can still see him today. I saw him earlier in the year. So he's been around for 13 years. Picture. And then a couple of years ago, these white colored ones started showing up. Here's one R. And these are the GPS transmitter ones. This little video here kind of gives you an idea of how hard it could possibly be to see it. As the swan kind of moves around, you can kind of get an idea of how hard it might be if you're looking with your binoculars or a spotting scope to kind of tell. That's why a telephoto lens with a camera works relatively well, because you can pause the video and you can take images of it. But just to kind of highlight that interior GPS study that was done by David Wolfson, the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, was funded partly by the Trumpeter Swan Society, and that the USGS unit, university, and I'm sure they had a number of other partners. But basically, this is kind of like an overall map that shows all the birds that were captured, and GPS transmitters were put on them. And this is a zoomed in version of showing the refuge. So obviously you can tell like where the birds are coming in, where they're leaving, which is kind of really important. You're looking at like what power lines that you might want to mark if they're not already marked. Some of these, and it would be nice to know if those guys can tell what the elevation is when these birds are flying. But you can also tell that there's a lot of use within the refuge, but they do come out and they feed in ag fields and go back and forth. So these are the Iowa swans. Again, you can kind of see this is one bird in particular that used the refuge. It was going back and forth, spending a fair amount of time among a number of different wetlands within the refuge. And then they're kind of, then he kind of flies south. But obviously, this is Bob Brown, which is a state area that's intensely managed for waterfowl. These are the Minnesota swans. This is the kind of like the whole United States. And here's more of a zoomed in version of it. And you can kind of see how much use they have within the refuge. And obviously they're moving back and forth outside of the refuge too, and going back and forth. This is Big Lake. There's a little state park over here in part of it, but this is an old oxbow lake off the Missouri River. Here's another like zoomed in version of it. You can see the movement back and forth between Big Lake and the refuge. Lots of use on the refuge. And our tour loop goes like right by most of this. I mean, this right here is kind of like interior. You won't see that, but there's still probably thousands of swans, and we have large numbers of swans that'll be out here visible to the public, basically. And then this is the Manitoba, Canada swans that were captured. And kind of the same thing. We can see areas where these birds are coming and going, and the fact that they're utilizing the refuge to spend a pretty good portion of their time when they're here. Good stopover information. Just kind of to break things up. And then it's kind of cool to kind of watch some of the behavior when the birds are here. These are those tundra swans. They're kind of like being a little territorial. Here's a short little video that shows what I would guess would be a couple of family groups trumpeter swans. You can see the number of cygnets there, and there's probably at least a half a dozen adult birds, and they're kind of being a little aggressive to each other, and kind of pecking back and forth. And then we also have like some of the rare color variants of trumpeter swans. Basically, a number of years ago, one of the local photographers from Kansas City, a guy by the name of Steve Hines, and he was really interested in the different color variations of swans. And they're basically, so him and I had numerous conversations about it, and he showed me an article that somebody had written in a birding magazine that talked about the trumpeter swans in Yellowstone, in the Yellowstone ecosystem that go up to Red Rock Lakes. And in there, I don't know if it was that article or a different one, they were talking about maybe up to 25% could have a little bit of leucism in them, or be leucistic, which kind of causes these different color variations. And it can go from the regular color form would be a black bill and black legs and feet. But you'll have anything from like a pink bill to pink feet, yellow or orange legs, and a black bill, maybe a little bit of yellow on the lores in various degrees. So that's why you kind of have to look real good between your trumpeter swans and your tundra swans sometimes. And various degrees of pink. And as you can kind of see these pictures, this is a little bit like that brownish yellow, a little bit darker brown, and then black and black. And then here's one that has like kind of like an orangish yellow feet. Here's a good representation of one that has a mostly pink bill and then yellow orangish legs. Here's kind of a little bit of partial pink and yellow legs. So what makes Loess Bluffs an important place for trumpeter swans and other water birds? Well, it all boils down to the habitat and wetlands being the main component of it. And for wetlands, there are basically three components that make a wetland. And I'm not going to go through and read these things out here, but basically it's three primary things. You're looking at water. You're looking at soil, like hydric soils or soil that won't drain water very easily. And then plants, wetland type plants, like cattails and bulrush and American lotus and various other types of plants, barnyard grass, smartweed, that type of stuff. And on Loess Bluffs, we pretty much have like all the wetlands that we have are basically floodplain or riparian or riverine wetlands. They're not like, and they're intensely managed. The infrastructure was actually built shortly after a lot of it and modified many times over since the creation of the refuge. But a lot of the stuff was originally built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the late 30s. But we basically manage for two different types of wetlands. We have semi-permanent wetlands or marshes, which we draw down about every 3 years. And that's where most of the trumpeter swans hang out, although they do hang out in our seasonal or moist soil units. But semi-permanent wetlands, looking at American lotus, this river bulrush, arrowhead, perennial smartweeds. We do have some seasonal, and some annual smartweeds, the word I was looking for, and cattails and various other plants. Wetlands are kind of like one of those diverse or dynamic systems that change a lot throughout the year. And then we have what's called moist soil, or basically seasonal wetlands that are drawn down every year. And the timing of drawdowns kind of depend on when the annual plants are going to come in and start growing, and then like also by bird species. We have kind of like an early, mid, and late, and then depending upon the timing, sometimes we draw wetlands down fast, and sometimes we draw them down slow, and sometimes that kind of depends on whether or not we get reflooded or anything like that by a flash floods and that type of stuff. So why do we manage wetlands, and why do we draw wetlands down? Well, primarily because dry cycle is an important part of wetland management. In fact, if you listen to like Dr. Lee Frederickson, who is kind of like what I would consider one of the godfathers of wetland management, he would always say that you want to keep wetlands dry, and in fact, in some of his classes, he would yell it. They got to be dry in order for them to be productive, because they kind of go through a cycle. Like our semi-permanents, we may draw down, we'll get a lot of annuals, and then some of our perennial vegetation will move in, and then as we keep it flooded, things will kind of degrade down. We'll have like muskrats that eat a lot of vegetation too, and then it'll become more of like a lake marsh situation. So in that period, or if we get a lot of American lotus, it's time to draw it down and start the cycle over again. So, and how do we do that? We use various different types of water control structures. So, I mean, here's a radial gate, some slide gates. Our most common one would be a stop log water control structure, a flashboard riser, screw gates. And then we kind of like Aldo Leopold, who's kind of like one of the fathers of habitat wildlife management. We basically use a number of the techniques that he had suggested, like the axe, the plow, the cow, fire, and gun were the ones that he suggested using. But for us, it's pretty much mechanical. We use mostly mechanical treatments, because you need disturbance to kind of get some of the annuals that come in. So we use mechanical treatments, and here's the ones that we use. We use mowing, disking, removing sediment, and rolling. And then we'll also use some herbicide, and then we'll also use fire to a certain extent. So this kind of highlights a little bit of rolling. This is like perennial smartweed. We went through, rolled it. It creates great mud flats for shorebirds. And then you get kind of looking at the disturbed versus the undisturbed, left and right. And then here's a bunch of barnyard grass. We use science to kind of tell like how much water a wetland can hold, or where we need to remove sediment. We can also tell like how many acres of certain inches or centimeters of water we have, which is good for knowing for like dabbling ducks or diving ducks need deeper water. Dabbling ducks need, that 10 inches or less water to utilize, and then shorebirds need like mud flats. So it kind of gives us an idea using like a staff gauge that's already set for an elevation to kind of know like where we can keep our maximum water levels. Also, these things you can kind of see here, like flash floods that we've had. And then just from that kind of data, we can kind of tell how much water we can hold in a unit, or what it looks like when it's flooded. Here's some typical wetland foods that we're trying to get to grow, and then just to kind of, they eat aquatic inverts, some seeds from various different types of plants. And then what are the swans eating? what are some of the important swan foods that we have? Well, swans are mostly herbivorous, so they're feeding on things like submerged aquatic vegetations like sago pondweed. We do have a fair amount of bladderwort. We do have some sago pondweed, but not a ton. But we have a bunch of coontail and bladderwort. And then we also have a bunch of, because we keep some of these areas in semi-permanent, we have a bunch of arrowhead. So they love to eat the tubers on that. And you can actually see the birds feeding on those tubers and getting all muddy on the head because they're digging down. And when you draw those units down, it looked like a hog was basically rooting, or somebody took a hoe or a shovel and dug a bunch of holes out there in the wetland unit. And then obviously for the refuge, we kind of sometimes have challenges like droughts, or we also have floods, which make managing wetlands and water difficult. So this is from the 2019 flood. So basically this is what it looked like. And this is, the ditch is high on the 18th of March, but this is like just 4 days later. This is kind of looking at some different areas at the same time. This one right here is basically just to the opposite end of this bridge. What it looked like. Here's March the 16th. And this isn't a big lake right here. This is what the river channel is supposed to look like. So the water is already out of the banks. This is the refuge right here. This is the refuge right here. So that was March the 21st. So it flooded basically bluff to almost bluff. So those are kind of the major challenges. I know I kind of skipped through there. I was trying to keep it within the 45-minute window. So that's pretty much mostly what I had. There's a lot of stuff to rattle through, but I appreciate you guys' time. So with that, I'll click to the question section.
Thanks so much, Darren. I personally really enjoyed learning a lot of new stuff that I didn't know about Loess Bluffs, and it was really interesting to learn about wetland management as well, because wetlands are key to trumpeter swan nesting habitat. Marianne will be asking the questions that you put in the Q&A box. So if you would do that, that would be great. So Marianne, are there any questions yet?
We do have several questions, Margaret. Thanks, Darren, for a really fascinating presentation. So the first question is, do swans only winter at the refuge, or do some live there as well? And secondly, do you know where they fly in for the winter from?
We have, and I probably didn't I kind of moved through it relatively quickly. We are pretty much mostly a migratory stopover or wintering area for trumpeter swans. We have had some that have stayed into June or July, but it's been pretty rare, and it's been kind of like nothing that's been real predictable. And in the number wise, it's usually only like a couple, like maybe a pair or maybe a juvenile or two. And we get birds. The GPS study obviously showed we get birds from Manitoba. We knew for years from the band studies that we had birds from Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Those are the primary areas where we were getting trumpeter swans coming from. Most of them, though, looking at the bands that I have seen, have been from Iowa.
Thank you. Our next question is, do the swans only, very similarly, what might be the impediment to trumpeters nesting in the refuge?
I'm not really sure what other than the fact that we sit a little further south than Iowa, and I know that there's been some records in Missouri, but I don't think and Margaret or somebody else from the society could probably speak better to this, but I don't know if it's just a facet of, because we usually keep at least one or two of our semi-permanent wetlands out of the 3 to 5, and sometimes it will have water in all of them. So it's not like not having the habitat for them. I don't know if it's just because it's hot and humid here in the summertime. I don't necessarily think that's the case, because the weather would be quasi similar in Iowa. So I don't know, really, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I'll pipe up here. So a couple things are happening. One is when the swans come down, they come down in family groups, and
Right.
The kids learn where to go, where to
Right.
winter from the parents. And so
Right.
then they go back to where they had, their nesting area, and then they'll find more. And so
Right.
one of the issues with the restoration programs is Missouri didn't have a restoration program. So the point is, for these states that did have the restoration programs, the hope was that eventually the birds from these restoration programs would begin to fill up habitat within their state and then pioneer into new areas. And so just like they're only just beginning to go into the Dakotas and just beginning to go into the Dakotas, if Missouri gets nesting swans, most likely they would be coming from Iowa birds. But Iowa just kind of stopped their program, just a few years ago. So I don't think that Iowa has the number of swans yet that would be pioneering for nesting purposes into Missouri. So I think it'll happen eventually, but I think it's those two issues, is that the birds migrate with their families, they go back to wherever their parents, taught them, and there's just not enough birds, in these other restoration programs that have discovered Missouri as a nesting territory.
Thank you. The next question is Big Lake part of the Loess Bluffs Wildlife Refuge, or is it a separate wildlife refuge?
It's there's Big Lake State Park. It's separate. There's a lot of private land around Big Lake. The actual park itself is only a couple hundred acres, but the lake is much bigger than that. There's actually a bunch of houses around the lake. A lot of the oxbow lakes in Missouri, people use them as kind of like weekend getaway type areas, probably similar to how they have them in Minnesota, where they'd have like cabins that they'd go to on the weekends or for a week or two or during the year. That's kind of how most of Big Lake is, but it does get trumpeter swan and other bird use, because it's a natural oxbow lake of the Missouri River. So,
is lead a cause of mortality in the swan population at the refuge? And go ahead.
I'm sure it probably is. I do see more often than I would like, but not like on a super regular basis, that bent neck that they usually get when they probably ingested lead. If you see one that's got a crook in the neck, and I know Dan and other photographers have taken pictures of the bent neck swans that are flying, but for the most part, a lot of times those birds move around relatively good until they can't anymore.
Does that affect the eagles that would eat the swan?
Yeah, I would assume. I mean, that's a potential. I don't know of an instance where that's happened, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it hasn't happened. So,
I have a question for you. What was the refuge like used for hunting? Because I know that sometimes in some areas, like even in Iowa, if shooting or hunting had occurred even like a century or so before, the
Right.
lead ammunition stays in the environment, might go down to the sediment. So at the refuge, has there been hunting?
Not. I mean, there's been limited waterfowl hunting on the refuge. We did have a small snow goose season via guides, but that was way after lead. They stopped using lead. However, we do have duck clubs all the way around, not around every part of the refuge, but on the east and west side. And then there's there's some to the north of the refuge. So I mean, those areas have been hunted for a long period of time, probably as long as the refuge has been around in various form.
But the ammo that had been deposited years before might still be there, but they're not using that now just because of
no
the regulations.
They shouldn't be.
Right.
And I don't think, I mean, most waterfowlers are usually pretty good about using non-tox, but
yeah.
What's
Any other questions?
Yes.
Sorry.
Actually, we have quite a few. We also have a lot of comments thanking Darren for a great presentation, and just really very positive comments on the presentation, Darren. The next question is, what is the lifespan of swans?
oh gosh, I don't know this answer off the top of my head. I'm sure it's probably in excess of 20 or 30 years though.
Can pipe in.
So, what's that?
I said I can pipe it for that. When Dave Hoffman from the Iowa DNR was talking to students when they were swan releases, he said that in the Iowa wild, they typically might live in the wild maybe 14 to 18 years, and some of them go longer. So I've gotten trumpeter watch reports from marked Wisconsin swans that are 20 years old and or 25. So if they're not marked, you can't tell. And so the only way we even know any of that data is because of marked swans and the people that report that.
Well, that's the important part of doing the mark, and that's one of the important things. Survivorship, or how long an animal lives, is a good reason to mark it, and that's how you can know that, like, that albatross from Midway Atoll Island lived to be like 70 years old. Is because it was a marked bird. So I mean, the same thing can be fleshed out from this project, and I'm sure somebody out there has like the definitive number of a marked bird.
We still have
like some of the banders.
We still have quite a lot of questions, so I'm going to move into a bit of a speed round to try to get through them all.
Oh, that's cool. I'll try not to get too wordy.
What is the favorite time of year for you personally at the refuge?
The favorite time of me for me is probably spring. Just coming out of winter. Although I do like fall and early winter migrate or wintering time as well.
Was Loess Bluffs originally an oxbow lake?
No. There's varying reports that, I mean, it was a big grassland with some floodplain, with a little bit of floodplain forest that more than likely had wetlands in it. If you look at some of Lewis and Clark writing stuff, and some of the prospective land cover maps that were created by University of Missouri, they have this area listed as kind of like a wet prairie, bottomland prairie, wetland type area, probably based off of soils and proximity to water. Obviously, some of the creeks that we have that flow through the refuge have been highly channelized and straightened. So, I mean, they used to wind, and they probably spread out in certain areas.
Do trumpeters feed on agricultural crops nearby, like corn or something else?
Yeah, they move quite a bit off and on the refuge. I mean, they feed on the refuge, but they do move back and forth for probably primarily corn, because the two main crops that we have are soybeans and corn.
They tend to feed corn. Yeah, it's already been harvested. Yeah.
This will be our last question. How far south do the swans migrate, and have they had issues learning to migrate since reintroduction?
If you look at 59NC, the one swan I was talking about, it went all the way to Oklahoma. But I mean, probably more recently, a lot of these birds probably move into Arkansas. And do they move much further south than that you know of, Margaret?
We get occasionally, I get reports, trumpeter watch reports from Texas, and I did get a call this winter when we had a really bitter cold, or a number of swans were down in Alabama. But yeah, so for the best wintering sites in the south, it'd be Loess Bluffs, Riverlands, and Heber Springs in Arkansas. Oh, so that was the end of the questions. Is that correct, Marianne?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Darren, for a great presentation. I really appreciate you doing this. And as many of you may not know, national wildlife refuges are extremely important for trumpeter swans. So trumpeter swans, as we know, are in at least 70 national wildlife refuges during the year. So I'm really happy that we have a chance to explore, one of the important trumpeter watch areas on a refuge. As you're going to be closing your browser, there'll be a brief survey. I already mentioned that, so I do hope you fill it out. I look at it very carefully, and you will receive a link to the recording in 2 days. So with that, thank you all so much for participating and coming. I really appreciate that, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. So thank you.